Morning. It's good to gather together again and gather around God's Word. We're going to continue our series on called Homegrown, and it's this idea of what does it mean to follow Jesus, to be disciples, people who apply the gospel to every single part of their lives. We've been talking about marriage, parenting, hospitality, money. And today, I'm going to talk about, in a sense, your time, but especially on Sabbath and rest. In the Ten Commandments, right, we read 6 days shall you labor, but the seventh is the Lord's. The seventh is a day of rest. Sabbath simply means rest. Sabbath, rest. You know, it fascinates me that we needed a command to stop, a command to rest. You know, I kind of get the commands, thou shalt not kill, of course not, a command to honor your parents, a command to not commit adultery, but a command to rest. I mean, you don't have to tell me twice. I'm all up for that nap. I'm willing to rest. And I think it's just, so what does it look like? What do we do? What's going on here? And so we're going to talk about that this morning. What does rest look like? And then what does Sabbath rest look like? We're going to look at a passage about Jesus and the life of Jesus in Luke 6, the verses 1 through 11. So look at it with me. One Sabbath, so we'll start right off, all right? On a Sabbath. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? And Jesus answered them, have you never read, a bit of an insult here to a bunch of Bible guys, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, like temple, tabernacle, and taking the consecrated, the holy bread, he ate what is lawful only for the priest to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. And then Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Imagine how they hear that. Well, on another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for reasons to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. The law that they had was if somebody was dying, you could do something about it. But if somebody's just merely sick or suffering in some way, you not on the Sabbath. That was kind of the rule. But Jesus knew what they were thinking. He said to the man with the shriveled hand, hey, get up, stand up in front of everyone. So he got up and he stood there. Then Jesus said to them, I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it? And he looked around at them all, and then he said to the man, stretch out your hand, and he did so, and his hand was completely restored. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. So just picture all that, right? Jesus walking through the grain fields. The guys are hungry. They grab some grain, they roll it, and get the kernels out and have a bit of a snack. It was breaking one of the 39 works forbidden on Sabbath. These were rules that were made by religious leaders to try to keep people, the Sabbath pure and keep people on the right track. Most of us probably say, well, that was incredibly legalistic. And I get that. I kind of agree in a way. But in a way, we're kind of self-righteous about it all, too. Notice Jesus doesn't say, I've come to get rid of the Sabbath. It made me think of how I grew up. I grew up in the church, and my parents, they had Sabbath rituals. If we needed gas, the tank was getting low, Dad would make sure he tanked up on Saturday night. Right? They're not going to go to the gas station on a Sunday. Mom would peel the potatoes for Sunday dinner on Saturday. Right? These practices. We never would have gone to a restaurant because you don't make other people work on the Sabbath. Right? All these things. Some of you maybe grew up the same way. I remember, I played ball hockey, and my parents were a little bit more relaxed in some ways, and so could play ball hockey on Sunday. That was fine to go to the local lacrosse box and a bunch of neighborhood kids, and we'd play ball hockey. But Dad said, church, grew up in Ladner, church was at 2 in the afternoon, and so Dad said, okay, you gotta come home prior to 2 o'clock so that the people going to the second service don't see you playing hockey. And then you can go back later. So, anyway, so yeah, legalistic, yeah. But I do have some sense, maybe as I get older, of an appreciation for a desire to keep Sabbath, as opposed to turn it into a free-for-all. You can do whatever you want, it doesn't matter. You don't even have to put any thought into it, right? So there's something about this. And Jesus says, I'm Lord of the Sabbath. He tells that story about David, right? Okay, David messed with it here. And so he's saying, yes, we don't have to be rigid, but we do need to have a desire to be Sabbath people. What does that look like? Jesus said, I'm all about the Sabbath. I'm not trying to dismiss that. And then we think of our culture, right? We don't know how to stop, how to rest. Nothing closes. 24 hours a day, always something, right? And we have that dynamics going on too. We don't know how to stop. So in a way, I would say we have no business judging any attempts to encourage attempts to keep Sabbath. Right? We should be careful with that. I was listening to Tim Keller, and he spoke of an article by a Jewish writer for the New York Times named Judith Shulevich. She wrote an article, Bring Back the Sabbath. She was raised Jewish and religious. She walked away from her faith, and then later on in her life, she writes this. I'm going to read some of it to you. She says, my mood would darken every weekend. I began to drop in on the synagogue. Finally, I developed a theory for my condition. Formerly, some suffered from the Sabbath with all its rules, while I now suffered from the lack of Sabbath. There is ample evidence that our relationship to work is out of whack. Let me argue for the process that has helped keep workaholism in check for thousands of years. Most people believe to stop working merely means to stop working. But the inventors of the Sabbath knew it was much more complicated. You cannot downshift and casually and easily. This is why the Puritan and Jewish Sabbath were so exactingly intentional. The rules did not exist to torture the faithful. Interrupting the ceaseless striving required a surprisingly strenuous act of will, one bolstered by habit and social sanction. That kind of got me thinking, right? You think, okay, you're going to stop working, just stop working. But it goes much, much deeper than that. It's incredibly naive to think you'll just stop when you need to stop, and you'll just give up your control when you need to give up your control. The ability to rest really is a matter of life and death and lifestyle. But it is not natural for sinful, self-centered man, and it is not simple. It takes discipline, and it takes practice. Why? Some of it's about, think of the job, your job, or the economy. We all feel somewhat insecure, right? Is it ever going to be enough? We could lose the job. We could lose, the economy could collapse. And we worry, and so we go after things. We go after more. Or else it's job expectations. You're always on, always connected. Even when you're not working, you're working. Never really stopping. Some sociologists say we used to get meaning in life from family, and many of us still do. So work was a way to bless your family. But now, often, you define yourself with it. You decide what you want to be, and then you have significance, which makes our expectations of work enormous. Enormous. So we are desperately in need of rest while at the same time unable to rest within ourselves. There's something deeper going on there. Tim Keller said, to practice Sabbath is a disciplined and faithful way to remember you are not the one who keeps the world running. And I think, and you say, well, of course, but I think there's ways we live where we act like we are God in some ways. And the ancient practice of Sabbath is about learning to rest. It's about learning to surrender, to reevaluate your identity, to celebrate relationships, to refocus. We need regular time for that. It doesn't just happen. I often feel like people are just go with the flow. They just keep going. They just keep flowing and flowing and flowing. No one stops, no one reflects, no one rests. I think that's what Sabbath is trying to get us to do. To get the eyes off of yourself and onto God and onto others. God knew we needed this, and he knew our tendencies to not do that, so he made it a command. Back to Judith Sulevich. She writes, when the Sabbath was still sacred, not only did drudgery give way to festivity and family gatherings and worship, but the machinery of self-censorship shut down too, stilling, and I like this line, the eternal murmur of self-reproach. You stopped enough to start figuring out the voices that were going on in your mind. You stopped enough to refocus. You know, Sabbath is about rest, and when we think of rest, yes, I need enough sleep, and that's true. We need good sleep too. REM sleep, deep sleep, yes. So yes, we need to rest from the physical exertions of life. But there's a deeper problem here and a deeper thing going on here. There's a work underneath the work that the writer calls the eternal inner murmur. The need to prove yourself. And that is incredibly tiring. And that work is never enough. It's never enough. I think as a pastor, I've often fought over the years against my desire to please people. And trying to keep everyone happy and satisfied. It's never enough. It just isn't. It's hard to rest from that. That's where we need rest for our souls. And a vacation then doesn't cut it. It's a deeper need, a soul rest, which goes beyond mere physical rest. Sabbath rest, we need it. That's why Jesus calls himself the Lord of the Sabbath. I am the Lord of what it means to rest. He says in Matthew 11, look at it with me. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke. Well, that sounds like a burden again, but it's not. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for what? For your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. In me, Jesus says, is the deep rest you desperately need. I am the Lord of rest. So if you want deep rest, you have to go to Jesus. And if you're still restless in those moments, then you need to learn what surrender is all about. How do you surrender to rest? It's sometimes like trying to get kids to go to bed. They desperately need rest, but they fight against it. And we sometimes do the same. And then I think of Genesis 2. Look at it with me. Genesis 2, verse 2 and 3. The seventh day, God has finished the work of creation, right, that he had been doing. And on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed that seventh day, made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. God rested, not because he was tired, obviously, but he makes things. He's been making things. I'll create the animals and create the trees and create all things. And then he says, oh, that's good. Oh, man, that is so good, too. Oh, that is good. And then he creates people and says, oh, man, that's very, very good. And rest then is about enjoying what has been done. How many of us run from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing to thing to thing? Never stopping for a moment and say, wow, this is really kind of cool. I really enjoyed this. I made something good here. I think a place where I do it rather well is if I mow the lawn. Right? It's so simple, right? Oh, here we go. There we go. Right? But, then, and especially when it's not yellow and dead, when it's nice, lush and green, and then you cut it and then you look back and the edges are done and it looks so good. And you stand back and say, that's good. For now. But you could say, oh man, it's going to grow again, then I got to cut it again. And, I'm concrete on everything, right? And it's just, I think, God was utterly satisfied with his creation and then celebrated it. So Sabbath is about celebrating what's good and enjoying it. Then we look at Hebrews 4, 9 and 11. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their work, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest. And there's that sense that we are like God in that sense. Through Christ, you can look at your life, you can look at yourself and others and your work, and you say, wow, that's really good. And Sabbath then is the time then to be also reminded who we are. God rested, we rest. We reflect his image, his divine image. And we are then reminded that we are more than just our work. We partake in the Creator's grand design and story of life. We are image bearers, and out of that we do what we do. Well, we muddy that water up pretty good. We don't do to score points with God. We work to get in on what God is already up to. Because, if you're trying to prove yourself to God, that work is never done. That's never enough. Rest says it's good, and I'm satisfied, and I celebrate it. Rest says it's finished in Jesus. One of some of Jesus' last words on the cross were, it is finished, and then his head hung down, and he gave up his spirit. It's finished. Only through Jesus is it finished. Only through him. It's interesting to me that Jesus called himself Lord of the Sabbath, and then the leaders were all mad, and they were furious, and they planned to kill him, and eventually they did. The irony was that through that death, Jesus then became Lord of all things, including Lord of the Sabbath. That's why you read it in 2 Corinthians 5. Look at it with me. Verse 21. God made him, Jesus, who had no sin, to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Not through your efforts, through Jesus. It is finished through him. We rest in that gospel truth. Rest was missing until Jesus came and finished it all. There was no more need for that inner murmur of self-reproach. He lived the life we should have lived, and he died the death we should have died. So when we follow Jesus, well, then we even though we try to be Christ-like, we're not doing it to score points. We're doing it because we recognize the finished work is in him, and he's at work in us. And through Jesus, then God looks at you and he says, you're good. You're so very, very, very good. And I can rest in that. How many of you have seen the movie Chariots of Fire? Yeah. Nobody younger, but anyways. Story of two runners, kind of Olympic kind of runners. One of them can't stop working, and he was asked in the movie, why are you working so hard? What are you doing here? And he said, he was a sprinter, he said, I have 10 seconds to justify my existence. Imagine living that. I have 10 seconds to justify my existence. Another one was a Christian guy named Eric Little. It's a true story. And he finds out that the race he was supposed to run in had been scheduled now to a Sunday. As a devout Christian, he didn't want to do anything on Sunday, so he says, I'm out. And he gets put into, he asked him, can I do another race? And it's a race he hadn't trained for, but he runs it anyway. The first guy does a sprint thing, and he runs, and he wins, but he isn't satisfied. It's never enough. I justified my existence in this 10 seconds, but now I got to do it in this 10 seconds and on this 10 seconds, and it's just never going to be enough. Eric Liddell, on the other hand, didn't run to satisfy anybody. In fact, I was talking to somebody about the movie, and there's a line in the movie where he's running, and he says, "I run because of the joy of running, the joy of being with God while I run." So the motives were so different. But, and so he was in Jesus. He knew life in Jesus was what he was living for. And so when it got moved and he had to adjust, well, he just adjusted. Interestingly enough, he won his race too. But anyway, that's another matter. Knowing all this, then you practice Sabbath. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Otherwise, if you think it's other things, it's you somehow, it's never enough, it's never good enough. You'll just keep running and running and running and running and never be satisfied. How do we practice this? Well, here's a few thoughts. You don't have to go through a list of do's and don'ts, how far you can walk and all that, but some structures are important. Some structures are important. They can be helpful. The practice of Sabbath is essential. I'm going to walk 15 steps and okay, no, not that. In a sense, I think what's important to remember that there are certain disciplines involved, but Sabbath, according to Scripture, is liberation. In the book of Deuteronomy 15, way in the Old Testament there, talking to the people of Israel, right? This chapter is all about all these Sabbath things. A Sabbath for the land in 7 years. A Sabbath for debt being forgiven. Imagine that in 7 years, right? Debt is forgiven, right? All kinds of things, all lifestyle things. And so then God says this, "Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I give you this command. Out of that knowledge, do Sabbath." Do Sabbath, out of that knowledge. "Remember you were slaves and you were freed. Therefore observe Sabbath." Slaves don't get days off. They just keep going and keep going. If you don't rest, you are a slave. A lot of you are always too busy. If you can't set aside some time, you're living like a slave. Slave to activities, slave to your insecurities, slave to expectations, slaves to culture, slaves to technology. Lots of ways to be slaves. And you have to say deep within you, Sabbath is an act where I am recognized, I am liberated in the saving and finished work of Jesus Christ. That's what we're doing here. It is an act of acknowledging God is God alone, and He frees me. And then, like the psalmist, we acknowledge, He who watches over you neither slumbers nor sleep. Isn't that good news? I can even go to sleep, knowing that the God of the universe is at it. And so I should be able to rest easy, albeit that's sometimes hard for us to do too. We can be weak. Why? Because God isn't. Wendell Berry, an activist and farmer and guy from quite a while back, but he writes, "It's easy to imagine that the next great division in the world will be between people who wish to live as living creatures and those who wish to live as machines." Just always going, always going, always going, always going, always going. And so, as the psalmist also says, I lie down, I sleep, I wake up because the Lord sustains me. There's this rest thing. When I rest, I say, hey, God's on it. And that's good. It's countercultural. Rest is the confession that is countercultural. We are not sufficient. We need care. We need God. And then this shows up in how we live and in our routines, including Sabbath. One writer put this question forward. I thought it was a good one. What if Christians were known as countercultural community of well-rested people who embrace our limits with zest and joy? Isn't that interesting? Say, boy, you seem really well rested. You must be a Christian. be a fascinating thing, right? Hyped up, stressed out Christian. I know they exist. We're all them. We are all those people sometimes. But it is not what Christ would have us be in those. He would ask us to be a people of rest. So each night when you go to sleep, in a sense, practice the Sabbath of letting go. Each Sabbath day, this rhythm of Sundays, we slow down, admitting life isn't all about our striving, but it's about recognizing that God is God and we rest in Him, and my work does not define me, Christ defines me. When I was going through a time of burnt, I was kind of burnt out, a time where I was running way too hard and I couldn't do it anymore. I was running on my own strength and rarely stopping. And got some counseling and spent some time taking a sabbatical in those days. And Psalm 121, verse 1 or 2 became important to me. Let me read it to you. Psalm 121, verse 1 or 2. A picture often happened. I was working at my desk, window over here, and I'd be anxious, fretting, and stressed out. And then I would think of the verse, I lift up, okay, so here's all the stress, and I lift up my eyes to those mountains, and then I ask, from where will my help come? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And I was refocused. And that happened several times a day. I still think that way. That verse still means a lot to me. A little mini Sabbath in the midst of busy days. Busyness is not really the problem. It's maybe more our mindset in some ways. A needed reminder about what the point of life is. I trust God. He keeps the world running, not me. He invites me in on what He's up to. And I think for a lot of us, we could do these mini Sabbaths. It's not just the Sunday thing here. You go for a little walk, go fishing, lift up your eyes to the mountains, to the hills, and in that rest, remind yourself who you are and what the point of it all is. You are a child of God, we sang that, who is dearly loved and completely cleansed. And that ought to lead us to worship. You know, I find over the years, more and more, I listen to songs that stir my soul and my heart. My wife and I, when we go on road trips, we love to listen to worship music together and sing together. My wife, once in a while, wants to raise her hand, so I open the sun roof so she can get the hand all the way up. It's a beautiful thing to sing together and worship together. Parents, too, with your kids, too. It's harder with teenagers, that's different. But. Right? And it's Sabbath. We are accountable to each other for Sabbath. It's a community event. We remember together. We remind each other. We encourage together. That's why the writer of Hebrews 10:25 says this, 24 and 25. Let us consider, okay, how are we going to do this? Let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. Oh, wow, that's a beautiful goal here. How is that going to be? Not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another. And you can only encourage one another when you're together. When we're here. And all the more as you see the day approaching, all the more as you see the end of time coming. Folks, if Sabbath is not part of your routines, for your family, for yourself, with music, with scripture, with gathering on Sundays, if it's not part of your routine, it's not going to happen. It's just not. There will be so many reasons to not stop and just to keep going and floating along in an unhealthy way. And in that, you'll miss the real point of life. And in that, you'll forget who you are. Because the world will be constantly trying to define you. I'm going to remember who I am and what the ultimate point is. Because I'm with you. And my eyes will stay on the one who said, it's all good. It's good. And so are you. Because my son came, and in him, it's finished. So follow him. Let's pray. Father God, we come before you and we thank you that you are the Lord of the Sabbath. You are the Lord of time. Lord, may we build our lives around you. You give us work. That's a wonderful thing. You give us opportunities. That's a good thing. But you also give us rest. You give us moments to stop and recalibrate and refocus and remind ourselves again that you are the Lord and we follow you and we work because you invite us into it. Lord, I pray that you bless us as a community, that we might encourage each other, that we might not neglect meeting together, because in the meeting together, your Spirit comes, and we are again reminded together that we are loved and that the finished work of Jesus is the point of our lives. So, Lord, thank you. Thank you for Sabbath. Thank you for rest. And thank you for loving us and saying to each of us, you are loved and you are very good.